Good morning. My name is Russ Bowers, and my main claim to fame in life is that Kate McLaurin is my daughter, which makes Tim my son-in-law, but more accurately, my son. And that means that Andrew, Isaac, and Eli are three of my grandsons. Thank you so much for welcoming them to be a part of Christ Chapel and for inviting them into your hearts and in allowing them to worship and serve among you, for being their church family. My own association with the Christian Missionary Alliance goes back to my own childhood. We did not attend a CMA church, but I can recall 2 summers in which I attended the vacation Bible school of the Christian Missionary Alliance Church in my hometown of Pittman, New Jersey. And on one of those years particularly, we had a teacher. I don't remember her name, but I do remember that she resonated very well with us in her class, and she taught us to memorize not just a few individual verses, but a passage. Our passage for that week was Isaiah 55, 6 through 11, and I can still remember good parts of that passage. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God, for he will freely pardon. And that passage has had a formative impact on my life for decades now, and particularly the latter part, which talks about the fruitfulness of God's word. When he sends it out, it will not return to him empty, but will accomplish that for which he sent it. Then from 1998 through 2004, my wife Glenna and daughter Kate and I lived in Cambodia, and Cambodia had for years been a mission field of the Christian Missionary Alliance Church. Over there they called it the CAMA, comma churches, but I had good associations with the Missionary Alliance people there in Cambodia. An ancient Chinese curse says, "May you live in interesting times." Our own times are interesting, and we can see why that may be a curse. Because what COVID has done to us, or what we have done to ourselves because of COVID, has changed all of our lives dramatically, and perhaps permanently. Personally, as families, as communities, as nations, as churches, on the job, life is different and challenging in ways that it had not been for many years. We live in interesting times. Compounded for all of that for Christ Chapel is that you are in the midst of a pastoral transition. And these are always testing times and thoughtful times as well, to add to the complexities that have been imposed upon us by COVID. We are tempted at times to ask, during seasons like this of uncertainty, where is God? Years ago, a concert pianist retained in his home a trusty servant whose job was, among other things, to rouse the maestro on those occasions when, although appointments awaited, he preferred to slug a bed. And those occasions were rather common. When the servant could not succeed in getting the master to arise, the servant would himself sit at the piano and begin to play a beautiful piece of music. Up and down the scales with the melody and the harmony, arpeggio, legato, and come to the final crescendo, and at the last moment, leave off the last chord. Then, 20 seconds later, a roar would erupt from the upstairs bedroom, and the concertmaster, hair askew and robe aflap, would fly down the stairs and pound out that final chord. He could not tolerate a piece of unfinished music. Now, all who have ever come to God have come by faith. Hebrews 11:6 says, "Without faith it is impossible to please God. For everyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." But no one has ever come to God with a perfectly informed faith. That is, with no errors or gaps or misunderstandings in it. And no one has ever come to God with a perfectly formed faith. That is, with nothing but confidence and assurance and with no doubts or fears or superstitions mixed in. How does God respond to us when we come to him with a very real but nevertheless faulty faith? Does he hold us at arm's length and refuse to answer until both the content and quality of our faith are complete? Happily, no. He does not wait for that before he meets our needs. Throughout the scriptures, God extends his hand to fallen humanity, longing to restore and bless and direct. His love for us exceeds our response to him. So when we come to him with a real, though faulty, incomplete faith, he answers to the extent our faith allows. But then, very often, he proceeds to strengthen, to stretch, to straighten our faith so that we know him better and he can do more for us. God resembles the pianist who could not tolerate a piece of unfinished music. But God longs to complete what has been started. He longs to perfect our weak faith so that we know him better and he can do more for us. Now, Jesus did that sort of thing all throughout his 3 years of ministry while here on earth, and he continues to do the same thing today. We find him engaged in this exercise in Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, the stories of the hemorrhaging woman and the healing of Jairus' daughter. Well, let's start with the context of this passage. In the immediately preceding passages, Jesus had already been involved in stretching and strengthening and straightening the faith of his own. In chapter 4, verses 35 through 41, we see Jesus calming the storm. The disciples were in the boat. Jesus was asleep. They roused him and said, "Master, don't you care that we are perishing?" And Jesus rose and rebuked the wind and the waves. "Peace, be still." The disciples responded with astonishment. "Who is this, that even the winds and the waves obey him?" The disciples had exercised faith in Jesus. They had left all that they had to follow him, and they were following him despite increasing opposition, but their faith still was not all that it could be. So Jesus took them through this challenging, threatening situation so that they could learn in a deeper way who he is, who he was. He's the one who can control the forces of nature. They didn't know that before, but they learned it through this traumatic experience through which they passed. And then the next passage, chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, we find Jesus confronting the man with the legion of demons. And now the disciples understand that Jesus' power extends not just to the physical realm, but to the spiritual as well. His miracles were often didactic in nature. Jesus' miracles are called signs because they point to something beyond themselves. Yes, they meet the immediate need, but they point to who he is and his greater program. So as we approach our own passage, starting at 5:21, we see that Jesus has already been busy stretching, strengthening, straightening the faith of his own, using traumatic experiences to do that, but with the goal in mind of perfecting a real but imperfect faith. And now we see him beginning the same process with the woman who had been suffering hemorrhaging for many years. In chapter 5, verses 25 and 26, we notice her condition. Her physical condition was that she had had this flow of blood for all of these years. It's interesting for Bible students to note the different way that Mark presents this from the way Luke presents it. Mark says she had suffered a great deal under the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. It sounds somewhat critical of the medical profession of his day. Luke, who was the beloved physician, says no one could heal her. You almost get the sense from Luke's account that he almost pities the doctors because do what they can't help her. Mark's rendition is much more critical. It's just one of those interesting passages that show why we have four Gospels, to give us four perspectives of the same event. I wonder which wording any doctors among us might choose to use if we were writing the text today. But at any rate, she suffered from this debilitating physical condition. As well, it had mental and social effects. Just imagine having this for a dozen years, what that would do to your self-image. But the social implications as well, because ceremonially, according to Levitical law, she was unclean. And that meant she could not enjoy the normal interaction with her community, with her family, with her peers for 12 years. Financially, she's broke because, as the text said, she had spent all she had. No wonder, then, she didn't want any public notice when she came to Jesus for healing. She just wanted to slip up behind, touch his robe, be healed of her disease, and attract no notice in the process. Her concept of, that was her condition. Her concept of Jesus in verses 27 through 28 is that she had heard about him and she knows, or she believes, here's a man who can help me. But in verse 28, she wants to touch his robe to get the healing. So probably her faith was mingled with some kind of error, or, for example, a popular belief of that day that was that a person's dignity and power were somehow transferred to the clothes that he or she wore. The opposite, I think, takes place today, and we think that clothes make the person. We will spend 2, 3, 5 times as much for the same article of clothing if it has the right label, because if it has the right label, that makes us somehow more important. But in Jesus' day, it was more the person makes the clothes. So her faith, real and in the right person, imperfect, mixed with these quasi-magical notions of the day. Now, it would be easy at this point to step aside for a moment and with raised eyebrows consider the barnacles or the fuzz that is attached to the faith of other people. Things that they believe are necessary or true but are not at all scriptural. What do we do about these problems of other people? Well, let's leave those aside and ask ourselves, what additions to biblical faith have I allowed to creep into my own ideology or my own understanding of who God is? And if some of those were shaved off, how much truer a picture of God and of the Christian life would I have? And we always need to be examining our faith based on what the Scripture says so that we believe and practice neither more nor less nor other than what the Bible teaches. But at any rate, here's a woman who comes by faith, but perhaps an insufficient, perhaps a somewhat faulty faith, and reaches out to touch Jesus' hem for the healing for which she so greatly longs. That was her condition. That was her concept of Jesus. But now verse 29, notice her cure. It says, immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. What a wonderful answer to this woman's faith in coming to the Lord for healing and for her need. But note Jesus' response to this kind of faith. He healed as she had hoped, Nor did he later give her some kind of theological orthodoxy test, but rather he took this faith and stretched it, strengthened it, and straightened it so that it would be truer. And that's what he does today. God does not wait until our faith is perfect before he saves or helps. What matters is not so much the quantity of our faith, but the quality of the Christ in whom we put our faith. He whom I bow to only knows to whom I bow. When I attempt the ineffable name, murmuring thou, and dream of Phidian fancies that embrace in heart meanings I know that cannot be the thing thou art. All prayers always, taken at their word, blaspheme, invoking with frail imageries a folklore dream. And all men are idolaters, crying unheard to senseless idols, if thou take them at their word. And all men in their praying are self-deceived, address one that is not, unless thou of mere grace appropriate, and to thee divert men's arrows, all at hazard aimed beyond desert. Take not, O Lord, our literal sense, but in thy great, unbroken speech, our halting metaphor translate. So she came with her faith, checkered with superstition, but a real faith. Her cure was simple, immediate, and obvious. Her condition, her concept of Jesus, her cure, but now her confession. Notice that Jesus is able to distinguish between being jostled in the crowd and the touch of faith. He's able to distinguish between the two today. And so he turns and asks, who touched me? The disciples were amazed that he would ask such a question, jostled as he was. But again, the Lord knew the difference between a jostle and a touch of faith. Who touched me? And as he kept pressing, the woman realized that she was not going to escape but had to come and confess. Remember that the last thing in the world she wanted was to be made a public spectacle of after 12 years of ostracism and poverty and physical frailty. But she had to come and confess. And many people today feel the same way. The last thing in the world they want to do is to stand up and speak publicly. Well, why did Jesus do this to her? What she wanted was her healing. She had gotten that. Why did he run her through the ringer to make her confess publicly what had happened? Why didn't Jesus just leave her alone? Well, he loved this woman, and he wanted her to know more of who he was. And what resulted from the fact that Jesus pressed the issue and she was forced to confess? First of all, she learned something about how much Jesus knows. Again, he can distinguish between a jostle and a touch of faith. She learned that. She learned, secondly, something of his personal concern for her. He called her daughter. It's the only time in the Gospels that Jesus called a woman by this title. Jesus is not just some magic worker or dispenser of miracles, but he loved her. He had a personal concern for her daughter. She learned that by going through this difficult situation. And she learned that what is important is Jesus himself, not his clothing. What releases his power is our faith in him, not some kind of magical manipulation. And through this process, perhaps Jairus himself, who's standing in the background, is prepared for his own miracle. So when we summarize this story of the hemorrhaging woman, what we see is that by putting the woman through this painful experience of having to stand and confess before the whole crowd, Jesus stretched, developed, clarified, and increased her limited knowledge of and faith in him. Jesus does not enjoy unfinished symphonies. His reaction to imperfect faith is to accept us on the basis of it, but then to stretch, strengthen, straighten it into a more complete faith. Is it possible during these interesting times that some crisis or series of crises has invaded your life something that you don't understand. Why is this happening? Something maybe to which you have come to the Lord for answers, and the answers are not there. A job situation, a family situation, a financial situation. What is God doing? Is he there? It may be that a loving God is seeking to develop and strengthen your faith into something much greater than you or I would ever have anticipated on our own. He wants us to know him better, more truly, and be able to use us more fully. Well, that's how Jesus stretched the faith of the woman. Now we turn to Jairus, with whom the chapter or this passage began in verse 21. He had come to Jesus and asked Jesus to come and heal his daughter, his only daughter. And so here's again another man with great faith who came to Jesus in his time of great need. And he came with intensity. Luke puts it, he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and he pleads with the Lord, come and heal her. But in the process of the Lord's coming, what happens? This woman interrupts. And Jesus turns his attention from Jairus, who had asked first, to the woman who had asked second. And although the text does not tell us specifically what Jairus' response was to the delay, we can imagine it. Delay is often the hardest trial we bear. The proverb says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. We may be tempted to ask, in the midst of our own trying situation, has the Lord become so wrapped up with someone else that he's forgotten about me? And then the messengers come from the home and say, why trouble the teacher anymore? Your little girl is dead. And the hopes that Jairus had invested in Jesus seemed dashed at that moment. But that's the moment when the Lord himself took over. And Jesus took the initiative. He took the initiative to act upon hearing the news of the death of Jairus' daughter, just as he took the initiative with the demonized man in the previous section, verses 1 through 20. In neither case could anything humanly be done. So God, Jesus, took the initiative. Just like in the Garden of Eden, when our first parents sinned, we find God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Adam, where are you? And Jesus takes this initiative at the point when they were just about to give up on him. Why bother the teacher anymore? Your little girl's dead. And that's sometimes when we are tempted to give up. Just when God's power can become the most obvious and dramatic. Just when our need is the greatest. Just when hope is at the threshold, the temptation is to give up. Of course, the psalm tells us the opposite. Psalm 50 says, call on me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you will honor me. So Jesus takes the initiative and says, don't be afraid, just believe, which, by the way, is a whole different paradigm from don't worry, be ye happy. That's not what Jesus is saying. But don't be afraid, just believe. And then he calls 3 of his own to accompany him to go and encounter this little girl who has just died. Now, why the limitation? Why were not the 12 invited? Why were not all the mourners invited to see? Well, it's like in the parables. Those who have already received are likely to be the ones who will get more. Sometimes we miss out with what more the Lord could do for us because we have not already responded in faith to what he has already done. The mourners demonstrated their disbelief in the passage, but there seem to have been layers of privilege and responsibility even among the 12. And Jesus takes the 3. And Jesus never sought to perform miracles to attract attention or in order to draw a mob because people would respond for the wrong reasons. So the Lord enters the home. The little girl is laid out dead. The mourners are mourning. Jewish custom required the hiring of professional mourners, at least one, and flute players, at least two. And the mourners were paid by the amount of tears that they collected in little tear bottles hung next to their eyes. And they would cry with increasing volume until the interment, and they would beat on their breasts and lament the loss. It was a very superficial kind of grief because in verse 40, their grief turns to sneering very quickly. But Jesus, with his three and the parents, goes into the room, goes to the little girl, and says to her very simply, Talitha cum. Aramaic, not Greek, because Jesus in his ministry probably spoke Aramaic. Interesting, again, the difference of the Gospels. Mark records the Aramaic. Mark, by tradition, is the Gospel of Peter's remembrances of Jesus' ministry. And years later, in the book of Acts, Peter would be called upon to raise a widow who had died, whose name was Tabitha. And I wonder sometimes if, as this account is being recorded, Peter remembers Jesus' word, Talitha cum, and perhaps Peter himself later said, Tabitha cum. But at any rate, a very simple directive, and the girl is raised from the dead. He commands, tell no one. Now, of course, the parents could not keep silent forever the fact that she had been raised, but they could keep under wraps the manner in which she was raised. To draw attention to the latter would to draw to Jesus just the kind of superficial miracle and signs and wonders seeking followers that he always discouraged. Jesus did not want people following him for those wrong reasons. And so the few observed and the most missed out. And then he said, give her something to eat. Jesus was always very practical and concerned for the physical. In their excitement, the parents' excitement at seeing their daughter raised, they might have forgotten that very practical step they could take. And so then Jesus begins to take attention off himself and involves them in the process. Now, Jairus and his wife had endured an intense trial. Their only daughter had died. She died after they had asked Jesus to help, and he had delayed. But by allowing this to happen, Jesus confirmed, stretched, strengthened their faith. Jesus does not want our lives to be unfinished symphonies. His reaction to imperfect faith is to stretch it. God's delays are not denials. They are disciplines. It reminds me of how in John 11, when Lazarus was sick, Mary and Martha sent word, Lord, the one whom you love is sick. And Jesus purposely stayed where he was for 2 days, with the result that he died. And Jesus was later to say, I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. Jesus himself was about to die, and they needed to see, both Mary and Martha and his own 11 at least, needed to see his power over death to sustain them during that period of his own 3 days in the tomb. He was not glad for the sorrow that it brought, but was glad for the lessons that they learned. I did this so that you may believe. She kept on getting weaker as day dragged into day. The doctors gave no hope for her. She seemed to fade away. My hours were filled with constant dread. Time became a knife that slowly and relentlessly cut the cord of life. There was a teacher in the region then, and some of us had heard how he healed a paralytic by the power of just his word. So, with hope again rekindled, I went at once to see if I could find a man named Jesus from a town in Galilee. I began to search the city, and soon I saw the crowd. They were pressing in to touch him, and they called his name out loud. But with the strength of desperation, I pushed them all aside. I threw myself before him, and from my knees I cried, "Lord, come and heal my daughter. Even now she's close to death. Her fever's uncontrollable. She fights for every breath. But God's given you the power. Life is yours to give. If you just lay your hands on her, I know that she will live. She will live. She will live." Well, he'd just begun to go with me when a face I saw with fear came toward me with the news I knew I didn't want to hear. And although I tried to steel myself, I trembled when he said, "Why bother the teacher anymore? Your little girl is dead." Then Jesus touched my shoulder and he told me not to grieve. The trembling stopped when he looked at me and said, "Only believe." And then he sent the crowds away except his closest men, and they followed right behind us as we started off again. But we were still a long ways down the road when I heard the sounds and cries of the mourners and musicians as they strove to dramatize my grief they had no business with beneath their loud disguise. And my wife just sat there silently and stared through empty eyes. Then Jesus asked the mourners, "Why is it that you weep? She isn't dead, as you suppose. The child is just asleep." It only took a moment for their wails to turn to jeers. "Who does this man think he is? Get him out of here." But with authority I've never heard from the lips of any man, he spoke, and every sound rolled out with a thunder of command. And in the sudden silence, they all hurried for the door, wondering what the reasons were they'd ever come there for. Then he called his 3 disciples that were with him in the way. He led them and my wife and me to where our daughter lay. He took her by the hand and told her, "Child, arise." The words were barely spoken when she opened up her eyes. She rose and walked across the room and stood there at our sides. My wife knelt down and held her close. And at last she really cried. Then Jesus told us both to see our daughter have some food, but as to how her life was saved, not to speak a word. Has God begun to write a symphony of faith in your life? Have you heard of who he is and what he wants to do? And have you come to him by faith as your Savior and Lord? And since then, has some trial come to you, some test, some sorrow, some complexing and confusing set of circumstances that you just don't understand? And you cry out to the Lord for help, but the answer does not come immediately. What is God doing with you? Is he there? Does he care? It may be that he wants to stretch, to straighten, to strengthen your faith and mine by teaching for us and doing for us more than we had anticipated. The question we need to ask is whether you and I as individuals will wait in faith and anticipation for him to act. And will Christ Chapel as a church wait and continue in faithful ministry until the Lord acts to supply the new leadership that the church needs and that the great shepherd longs to give you. May God give us the grace to wait and allow that stretching process to be completed in our lives. Amen.